Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Good morning, Tampa Bay. Welcome to the Morgan Streetman Show with your host, Morgan Streetman. Roxanne Wilder's out today, but we got Pat George with us.
I'm here pushing the buttons for you.
A good man, good man. We got a lot of things to cover today. In fact, I've got more topics and more audio than I think we've got time for the show, but I've got a lot of interesting things I wanted to go over with the audience here, with everybody listening. And, of course, there are so many different things we could talk about. In fact, Pat George, you were asking me, we're going to talk some about Seattle. And no, I really don't have anything to talk. I mean, I could talk about Seattle, but I didn't have anything planned. But we just got so many things we can talk about right now. There are so many things going on. And some even that I bet you haven't really even heard about, maybe even some of the biggest news of the week last week, you may not have even heard about because the media is so focused on things like, well, how did President Trump walk down the ramp after the West Point graduation ceremony? And, oh, my gosh, how many open seats were there at his rally in Tulsa and other things, distractions like that, where they leave the big stories completely uncovered. So we're going to try to get into some of those and give you some real interesting information. I think we're going to start out with a quick look back at the Justice Department's investigation of President Trump. So the investigation of the investigators, right, which is called the Durham investigation.
Oh, it's so confusing.
I know, and that's part of what plays into the strategy of keeping people confused and distracted. But, you know, things seem to be happening in the John Durham investigation. And yesterday on Maria Bartiromo's show, Sunday Morning Futures, Bill Barr, the Attorney General of the United States, gave an interview. And it was a pretty broad-ranging interview, and we're going to cover some different parts of it. But part of it did relate to the Durham investigation. And I thought it was pretty interesting because he said that COVID-19 has actually slowed the progress of the investigation. And then he didn't really say it explicitly. Maria brought it up, but he kind of wouldn't commit either way. But the problem is they can't convene a grand jury during this COVID period because of the social distancing requirements, health and safety, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, are they trying to convene a grand jury? Are they trying to seek indictments against people? Are they trying to seek indictments against some of the top FBI officials? I mean,
or are they hoping we'll just forget about it? It'll go away.
Are they, as some would say, are they just running out the clock to the election? Because let me tell you something. If Donald Trump does not get reelected, all these investigations are over. They stop immediately. You'll never, I mean, of course, now, Donald Trump stops an investigation and everybody goes ballistic and says it's obstruction of justice. You watch. If Joe Biden comes in as president, the moment he comes in as president, all these investigations will stop immediately and nobody will say a word. Not one of these outrage mobs from the left will say anything, not the mainstream media. Nobody will say anything about all these investigations getting canned, and that's if Biden wins. So you need to take that into account when you're voting. If you want these investigations to continue, then we've got to keep President Trump in office. Now, one of the things that I thought there was a couple things that Bill Barr said, and we've just got a couple of quick clips that we want to cover with you. And one of the things that he said that I found, you know, pretty powerful was how he described what was going on at the time. Now, he's very careful to try and preserve, you know, the objectivity that he's got to have until the indictments are returned and the cases are filed. So up until that point, you know, he's got to remain open to wherever the facts lead. He can't prejudge the case, so to speak, and it can't appear as though it's some kind of a political prosecution. So he's got to be very careful with the way that he words his answers. But one of the things that he did say that I thought was so powerful is that he thinks this was basically part of an organized effort to remove a sitting president. And I want you to just listen to this clip and you tell me what you think about it. It's a pretty short clip, but this is Bill Barr on Maria Bartiromo's show yesterday morning.
A source said to me a couple of years ago, speaking of the Russia collusion story, that this was the closest the United States ever came to a coup to take down a president since the assassination of Lincoln. Is that an appropriate statement?
In this sense, I think it is the closest we have come to an organized effort to push a president out of office.
Wow. I mean, he just said that it's the closest thing we've had to a coup since Abraham Lincoln's assassination. I think they may be missing one major assassination back in the 60s. John Fitzgerald Kennedy. But okay, leaving that aside, I mean, it's a pretty powerful statement coming from the Attorney General that he basically thinks this was a coup by people within the government to try to remove a sitting president. That's a big deal. Now, there's a reason he thinks that. You know, first of all, we on this show have told you through the years all the different evidence that supports that type of conclusion. And he's got all that evidence, but then he's also got some more evidence that we haven't even seen yet. He's probably got some private emails, private text messages, private phone calls, other records that we don't even have access to yet, we haven't seen yet. And that's what John Durham has gone around and collected during his investigation. And I don't think Bill Barr is saying this to go out on a limb. I think he's only saying this when he knows he's got more than enough evidence in his back pocket to prove everything he's saying, because that's the kind of guy he is. He doesn't want to be overextended. So big things are coming, I believe, in this investigation, unless they use the COVID thing and then the clock just gets run out. We get to the election, nothing ever happens, and then all the investigations are shut down. But I thought there was another part that was particularly interesting because, as we've told you before, folks, this investigation fell apart before it even got started, right? This investigation fell apart at the latest in January of 2017 when the FBI went and interviewed the primary subsource for the Christopher Steele dossier, the so-called Christopher Steele dossier. It was all based on rumors that were told to Christopher Steele by one guy. One guy. He's called the primary subsource, and they rarely use his name. We've told you what it is. It's Sergei Milian. And this is known. This is not a secret. We're not revealing any national security information here. The media doesn't give you these kind of details, but if you dig, they exist. They are public knowledge that the primary subsource said in January 2017, basically, this is all just bar talk. This is all made-up stuff. And, hey, I don't even believe it, he said to him, to the FBI. And I don't know why Christopher Steele put it down as though it was true, because I told him it was just bar talk. But they knew that early. But now listen to when Maria Bartiromo puts Bill Barr on the spot about two of the people who knew. They knew what the primary subsource said in January 17. That's James Comey. That's Andrew McCabe. At least those two knew. And, of course, you can count Lisa Page, Peter Strzok. You know, they're minions. You can count the minions in with them. But the two leaders of the FBI, the director and the deputy director, both knew that the primary subsource was saying this information is just made up. And listen to how Bill Barr reacts when he's asked, basically, are they going to be subject to indictment for what they knew? Listen to this.
In January 2017 and in March 2017, they talked to the primary subsource, who was the sole conduit for this information that made up the dossier. And as I've said, the dossier pretty much collapsed at that point, and yet they continued to use it as a basis for pursuing this counterintelligence investigation.
So does it sound like Jim Comey and Andrew McCabe knew that the dossier had collapsed in January of 2017?
I don't want to discuss that aspect of it.
Oh, he doesn't want to discuss that aspect. Why? Because that's exactly what they're looking at, and he doesn't want to be argued to have prejudged the case. So that's what Durham is focusing in on, or at least part of what he's focusing in on. That's what we've told you about for going on now more than 3 years, that this issue was in existence, that this was a problem, that the FBI had put forward this fabricated, this false dossier and tried to use it as evidence of something, which it wasn't evidence of anything. It's bar talk. It's made-up stories. You know, folks, you and I could sit down and we could write up our own dossier. We could just make stuff up. And then we submit that to the FBI and we tell them, hey, we just made this stuff up. This is rumors. This is innuendo. We've been watching a lot of Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, and we're pretty sure these things are true. And we give it to the FBI, and the FBI is like, okay, we're going to take this. We're going to act on this. You know, that's how solid we think this is. No, the FBI is smarter than that. They knew this dossier was bogus. They knew these claims were bogus. In fact, James Comey's even confessed to that in some of his many interviews, you know, that this was a salacious and unverified dossier. When he approached the president about it in early January of 2017, that's what he told the president. And remember, that whole interaction was merely a pretext so that then the mainstream media could run with the leaked details. Remember all the salacious details? We're not going to get into them, but all those salacious details about Trump in Moscow for the Miss Universe pageant and the dirty things that he did in Moscow, that was all BS. And they knew it, and they ran with it. Remember, the Mueller investigation didn't even start until May of 2017. So they knew in January everything was bogus. But they still ran with it several months later. And then they, of course, ran with it for another 2 years. And we lived through all that. And then Bob Mueller testified. Everything fell apart. Up, and then don't look over there. Don't look behind the curtain. Look over here. It's something about Ukraine now. Now it's all about Ukraine. Let's go Ukraine. And let's go impeachment. Let's go COVID-19. And let's go police. Defund the police. And folks, we can't even get our feet under us. We just stay distracted and confused and not focused on the real issues, which that there was a coup in this country. We'll be right back. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. You know, I've got so many things I want to cover with you folks today. I mean, there's just a lot of things to cover, including the major Supreme Court decisions last week and more coming this week, we expect, and what the implications of those are. But, you know, the issue that seems to be one of the biggest in our society right now is the breakdown of civil order and this concept of defunding the police and what they call the BLM movement. And so I want to get into a little bit of that. But before I do that, I'll say I've talked to a number of our listeners over the last couple of weeks, and I've gotten a little bit of criticism here, and I just want to be direct and honest with our audience about where I'm coming from and let you know what I believe. So I've gotten some criticism saying, Morgan, I think you're being too politically correct about this stuff. You know, you won't just say what you think. And here's the thing. I want to be honest with the audience. I want everybody to know what I really think. I'm not putting on airs here. I'm not trying to play a role. I'm not trying to, tell you what you expect me to tell you. I'm trying to tell you what I really think. And part of what I really think about this whole concept of systemic racism, this concept of police brutality, etc., comes from trusting people that I know personally with their life experiences and what they think about it. Now, I just want to say, as an overarching concept, I believe that police brutality, I believe that racial discrimination, racism, all these things are on a serious downtrend in our country and have been for decades. But there's no question that at one point they were a big deal in this country. So, and a lot of people still remember those days and remember those experiences. So I want to share with you something, and this is going to be actually a little bit of a longer quote, but I want you to listen to this carefully. This is one of my favorite people, one of my favorite thinkers, and that is Dr. Tony Evans. And this is what he has to say about systemic racism. And I'll tell you, I know him, and I trust him, and I believe what he says. So I want you to listen to this, and I want you to consider it as well.
In light of all that's taking place today, there's so many questions. The division, the conflict, the misunderstanding. I thought I would take a moment to address one of the subjects that regularly comes up that people are confused about, and that is, what is systemic racism? Well, first of all, let's define racism. Racism is the conscious or unconscious belief in the superiority of one's race over and against another race. That feeling, that belief, gets manifested in the use of power or influence or resources or even communication that seeks to reject or marginalize or even oppress a person of another color, race, or ethnicity. When we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about the presence of racism, as we've just defined it, being embedded into the structures of society, whether those structures are political or economic or legal or medical or related to housing or employment. It is where it has become part of the policies or procedures of a way a particular entity operates. Of course, we're all aware of the evil system of slavery. That was a legal system that oppressed a group of people because of the color of their skin. But that got embedded into other structures in society. For example, criminal justice. There was a practice called peonage or debt servitude, where after the 13th Amendment was established granting freedom to slaves, there was a clause that said unless you're a criminal. So what was done was the criminalizing of men for the most minor of infractions so that the 13th Amendment could not be applied. And they would be held in servitude, oftentimes way beyond what they were arrested for, and many times they were arrested for little or nothing, in order to keep them from being able to claim the freedom that was being granted by the 13th Amendment. It showed up in the way people were denied employment or educational opportunities, or being able to access the goods and services during Jim Crow segregation. It showed up in churches that were unwilling to accept people of a different race because of the color of their skin. Or I can speak personally when I was told when I was trying to enter into the media ministry that a black speaker would offend too many of our white listeners. There was a system at work that was denying equal opportunity and equal access. Those systems, while a person may not be personally a racist, can be supported by supporting the structure that is that way. And unless you're not only not a racist, but that you speak against racism where it shows up, it can continue to be part of the fiber of a particular way a particular structure operates. When you understand that in a race, some people, if they are allowed to get started quicker and faster, or start at a starting point much ahead of where another group is, that the group behind has to play catch up. And at least being empathetic and sympathetic, that has been a historical reality, not only in people's personal views, but in the structures that people have believed in, supported, affirmed. Then you understand why there is a catch-up that needs to take place. And when you understand that, appreciate that, and grasp that, it does give you a different sensitivity to the reality. Now, of course, that sensitivity must be handled in not only in an empathetic way, but a responsible way. But at the same time, just knowing that people have been held back, people of color have been held back by structures, not just by individuals, helps you to understand why certain elements within our society need to be corrected so that equal opportunity is granted, the granting that God gives all men and the granting that the United States offers to all of us as well.
That's powerful stuff. Well, I think the key points, and we have to figure out what does it mean to correct these things, because we don't all agree on what the right steps are to correct these things. But one of the key points he made is the need to be empathetic and sympathetic, that the fact that the system was systemically racist for many years, and probably not within any of our lifetimes was it as bad as it was, like back during Jim Crow. I mean, Pat George, you may have some recollection of those time periods or before. I mean, things used to be pretty bad. And we're going to hear from Bill Barr a little bit later, and he's going to also acknowledge that America's laws were systemically discriminatory for many years. But the question then becomes, what's the right thing to do about it? So the answer is you don't deny that this existed, but we got to figure out what's the right thing to do about it right now. And I think reasonable minds can disagree on that. But one thing I don't think that should be done about it is I don't think we ought to take our country and turn it into a Marxist country, a communist country, to somehow, quote unquote, make this all right. But that's exactly what the BLM movement seeks to do. And we've told you that before on this show. Now, if you don't believe me, here's Patrisse Cullors. She's being questioned. She's one of the co-founders of the BLM movement. And I want you to listen here to the end of this clip because it's where it gets really important, where she talks about her training. And she admits exactly where she's coming from, and it's what I just told you.
He was concerned, or is concerned, that that there's a lack of perhaps ideological direction in Black Lives Matter that would allow it to fizzle out, as he said, in comparison to Occupy Wall Street. As you are advanced in your own organization, as you all are headed to Cleveland to participate in this Black Lives movement conference, how do you respond to that particular critique? Again, a loving critique from an elder of the struggle that some others share, that I've even shared as well, to be frank, as a concern about, in part because of the co-optation and the appropriation, that a more clear ideological structuring might be of some value here. But how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticisms?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself,
listen
Alicia
here,
in particular, are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
BLM are trained Marxists. Do you hear that? Trained Marxists. This is the revolutionary struggle. We'll be right back. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Well, before the break, we just played for you a clip from one of the founders of the BLM movement, wherein she says explicitly that she and her colleagues, the founders of the movement, are trained Marxists. So what does that mean? Well, another synonym for Marxism would be communism. So they consider themselves trained communists, but the theories of Marx that underlie communism are basically that all of human history can be explained as a struggle between two classes, basically the haves and the have-nots, or the owners of the means of production, who are called the bourgeoisie, and the workers who actually work those means of production. That's called the proletariat. And so in Marx's view, and in the view of communism, all of history surrounds this master-slave relationship between the owners and the workers. And the concept is that there needs to be a violent revolution by the workers. You know, it's like, rise up, members of the proletariat. The only thing you've got to lose is your chains, and you take over the ownership of the means of production. Of course, that's the aspirational statement in the philosophy that's written down on paper. And the reality, of course, becomes becomes something very much different. You know, look at what happens when Stalin gets into power, when Lenin gets into power. Is everything shared among all the people? No. Now the people in charge, based on that ideology, they enjoy a lot of advantages and benefits. And once again, the normal people are left starving. The proletariat that they profess to care so much about are left starving. And that's what will happen here as well. But I had a longer clip that sort of sets this up, but I wanted to play another clip for you just to drive this point home, because this is nothing new, as we've told you on this show before. This is what BLM has believed from the beginning of its movement, and they speak on this. They're in this to violently seize power. Now, I want you to listen to one of the co-founders, not the one we just heard from, but the one she mentioned when she said, myself and Alicia are trained organizers, we're trained Marxists. Well, this is Alicia speaking at UC Berkeley, a very friendly audience, by the way, the Gender and Women's Studies program at UC Berkeley. And I'm just going to play the shorter version of this clip. There was some good stuff in the longer version, but we're running out of time. But I do want to get to this, and I want you to listen for the end of it, where she says what they're building and what they plan to take, because that's the key point.
Again, not a spectacle. This is real life. They're willing to take and interrupt life in pursuit of their vision and values. They're serious about that. So if we're serious about living up to the legacy of this place, where the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense originates, where the Third World Women's Collective originates, then let's do it right. We're going to stand up every single time they come. We're not going to stay home. We're not going to just stick a sign in our window. We're going to confront. We're going to say, no, you're not coming here again. Not here, not now, not ever. So no, the goal is not to change the minds of mainstream white America. The goal is to signal that we are building power and we plan to take it.
Whoa. We're building power and we plan to take it. And that means take it by force, folks. Don't fool yourselves on what they mean by that. And you can go and you can listen to all these speeches, and you can even find more detail, and there's more detail we could have shared with you, but we're running out of time. I wanted to just clue you into that, though, because that's what's going on here. That's what the BLM movement is. It's a communist, violent revolution. And don't fool yourself if you support it, because the name is catchy, like we told you. That's Marxism. They're all about the catchy names. They know how to control people through the use of language and the twisting of language. And that's exactly what they're doing. Now, Bill Barr also speaks to this, and I want you to listen to Bill Barr. Much more measured tones that he's adopting recently. I mean, he's very calm and measured. And he admits that for much of our history, our laws have been explicitly discriminatory. But then I want you to hear this part of it. You know how many African Americans were killed by the police last year? 10. You know how many African Americans were killed by homicides last year? About 8,000. So 10 out of 8,000 were killed by the police. And oh, by the way, 6 of those 10 were actually actively attacking the police officers when they were killed. I mean, this is pretty important stuff. So to say that this is some kind of a Holocaust or that this is going on all over the country all the time, there's not even one per state. There's about 1 out of every 5 states has 1 person killed each year. And hey, a lot of these people were attacking the police. And, you know, what do they expect was going to happen? So let's listen to more from Bill Barr on Maria Bartiromo's show yesterday.
The job of being a policeman in the United States these days is the toughest job in the United States. They're under a lot of pressure, and I was concerned even before these pressures that we were having difficulty maintaining the levels of police we need in our cities, retaining them. And obviously this environment where they're demonized will deter a lot of people from continuing to serve as police. And also, I'm concerned of the effect that they may pull back some of their enforcement activities and not take those risks. So I think it could lead, as it's led in other situations, to an actual increase in violent crime and more deaths. I understand an event like Minneapolis and why it struck such a chord in the African American community. There has been longstanding distrust of law enforcement, and that partly comes out of the fact that for much of our history, our laws were explicitly discriminatory. And for the past few decades, we've been reforming our institutions to make sure they reflect our values, and the police have been engaged in that. And we shouldn't let this incident and the actions of a bad few obscure the fact that the police have made a lot of progress. Instances of the shooting of black unarmed males has been dropping. It was 38 5 years ago. Last year it was 10 in the nation. And 6 of those were involved in attacking the police officer at the time they were shot. So while any death is too many, the fact is that in proportion, it's relatively small. I mean, there are roughly 8,000 homicides of African Americans in our country every year. 8,000. 10 last year were due to force by the shooting an unarmed black male. So we have to keep that in perspective, and we also have to keep in perspective that the police forces are much more diverse. The leadership of the police is much more diverse. They are committed to reform. Community policing has been taking hold around the country. And that reform has to continue. And what we have to do is bring out of these episodes, Minneapolis, something that's good, and that is it'll galvanize the public will to continue that process of reform. But it has to be fair reform to the police.
So the right response is to continue the reforms and all the progress that we've been making. Police killings of black people are way down in this country. Even from just 5 years ago, it's about a quarter of the number. But it's a small number no matter what, particularly when considered in light of other homicides. And then if you really want to be controversial, add abortion to that. Add the number of black babies that are killed by abortion to that total. When Planned Parenthood offices are located in predominantly black and minority neighborhoods for exactly that purpose, for purposes of eugenics. And we've covered that on this show. You can look that up. Planned Parenthood is about keeping there from being too many black babies in this world who are not supported economically. That was their reasoning from the beginning. That's what Margaret Sanger went around and preached to groups, including members of the KKK. So you want to talk about racism and you want to talk about systemic racism, look at Planned Parenthood. That is systemic racism right there. Meanwhile, everybody's focused on the 10 people who died last year. Well, what about all the others? What about all the others, and where's the outrage on that? And what kind of a world are we creating for ourselves? I mean, did you guys hear this over the weekend? TPD was ambushed. This blew my mind. TPD was ambushed early Saturday morning. Basically, a call came in about 1 a.m. that there were shots fired and there was a victim of a shooting, and it was at North 15th Street and East 26th Avenue in Tampa near Ybor City. And basically, the police officers responded to this call. When they arrived, a crowd surrounded them in the middle of that intersection.
All
where
four corners.
Yeah, you heard about this, Pat George.
Sure.
And they surrounded him. They started jumping on the car. They started throwing bottles at him. In fact, one police officer got hit in the head by a bottle. Yeah, the media is not covering this. You go look online. This was barely covered over the weekend. There was no shooting. There was no shooting victim. They called the police out for purposes of ambushing them with a mob. So that's the violent struggle. That's where we're going in this country. Is that the kind of country you want to live in? Do you want to live in a country where a mob attacks and tries to kill police officers? I know I don't. I mean, sure, there are reforms that need to happen, but that's not the way to go about it, and that's not going to lead us to anywhere good. So we need to think about the results of this kind of language that's used and what's going to happen to us ultimately when we destroy the police, when we make it almost impossible for anybody to be a law enforcement officer. I mean, let's face it, who would want to? You don't make that much money. Now, everybody seems to hate you. People are trying to kill you. You go to a Wendy's or let's say a Shake Shack, you get a shake, and the people behind the counter are putting chlorine in it, bleach. They're trying to poison you. And this happens. You can see these stories all the time. People spit in their food. They do these things. So why would you want to be a cop? I mean, let's be honest. There's got to be easier ways to make money, less stressful ways to make money, less threatening ways. You're not going to have your life in danger. You don't make that much money as a cop. And who's going to want to do it? And that's part of the plan as well. So what's going to happen to our country when we don't have any law enforcement? Who's going to protect you at your house from home invaders?
That's why gun sales are so gone off the charts right now, along with ammunition.
That's right, but that's not going to be a good development.
That is not the answer at all.
When we start having to take
Yes.
violence into our own hands to protect ourselves, things are really going to go off the rails quickly. It's a bad situation, and that's why we need to maintain the rule of law in this country. We need to continue to follow through with the important reforms that have been going on for decades to policing to make it more fair. We need to recognize and be empathetic that, yes, in our past, the laws have been racist, they have been discriminatory, and we've got to fix that now. But we also need to recognize that we have been fixing that. We're on the right path. We're on the right path. These things are almost disappearing from our society. And, I don't run into racists. I don't even know where they are. I guess they claim they're all out somewhere out in the Northwest or something. I mean, in these enclaves. But I don't see them around anymore. So, I know it's still a problem that somewhat persists, but we're making progress and we're on the right track. And we don't need to now, right here at the end, when we're just about to finish this progress, we don't need to now switch it over to a communist revolution and destroy our entire system of civil interaction, law enforcement, and government. And that's what the BLM movement wants to do, and that's what you should be concerned about. We'll come back on the Morgan Streetman Show. Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Other big things are afoot in the news, and we really won't be able to get to all of them today, but I did want to cover briefly just a couple of things. Now, last week you may have heard there were some big decisions that came down out of the Supreme Court, and it's frankly got a lot of legal conservatives scratching their heads because there's been a movement among legal conservatives over the years to actually get some folks into different positions as judges who shared the legal conservative viewpoint, which was originalism and textualism. And that basically means that the way you interpret a law is based on the text of the law itself, not a bunch of other things. First you look at the text itself, and you try to interpret the text as the original meaning of the text would have been when the law was written. Okay, so you don't get into things like, well, what was the legislative intent? And the reason is because, well, I guess it depends on the legislator you asked, right? Because these legislators, they vote on something, they all had a different intent. So there's no legislative intent. There's no sense of Congress. We don't know why they actually did this stuff. So all we can reasonably base an interpretation on is the text itself. You know, we don't want to go find out, well, how do they do it in China and India? Because that doesn't matter because those aren't our system. So we need to base it on the text itself. And that really has been the undergirding of the entire legal conservative movement, which has built a lot of momentum in this country from almost zero. Because back in the early 80s, there were almost no legal conservatives. There were very, very few. And then a group started called the Federalist Society, and it's grown to be quite an influential group. And part of what the Federalist Society has been able to do is have influence on who's been appointed as Supreme Court justices, including John Roberts, including Neil Gorsuch, including Brett Kavanaugh, Samuel Alito, others, Justice Thomas, others. All of the good conservative justices have generally come out of the Federalist Society model for legal interpretation. Certainly Justice Scalia was sort of the godfather of that movement. So, but what happened last week? Last week we got some decisions, and I'll tell you, it's come to show you that you can't count on these people. Now, we already knew we couldn't count on Chief Justice Roberts, right? After he decided that Obamacare was going to be upheld, we knew the guy was a total sellout, and he does not disappoint yet again, because last week 2 rulings came out. The DACA ruling, which basically said, first of all, it's acknowledged even by President Obama that he didn't have the authority to do DACA, the delayed arrival, childhood, whatever it is. It's for folks who were brought here by their parents illegally, and they're saying we're not going to deport them, okay? Now, DACA was not legal. President Obama admitted he didn't have the authority as the executive to do it, but he did it anyway. And then President Trump came in and he said, we're gonna stop DACA. We're going to end that program. And now the Supreme Court said, well, you didn't give us a good reason for that. You didn't comply with the Administrative Procedures Act and give us a reason that wasn't arbitrary and capricious. Now, you might be able to do it, but you haven't done it so far. And I'm going, wait a minute. You telling me that the president can't stop doing something that's not legal to begin with, and you're citing some act like the Administrative Procedures Act to constrain his conduct? That just doesn't make any sense. The reasoning is very thin on that. It's obvious what they're doing. I mean, this is plain. They want to stymie President Trump's efforts at every turn, and the globalists don't want to stop illegal immigration. Period. The end. That's all there is to it. So that decision came down 5-4 with Justice Roberts siding with the quote-unquote liberal wing of the court, okay, who never seems to have any defectors, by the way. If you notice that, they stick together. Those are 4 solid votes. The conservative wing, which technically has the majority of the court, can't seem to stick together on any of these. The other decision that came down last week is what's called the Bostock case, and that involved the expansion of Title VII, which is under the Civil Rights Act, prohibits sex discrimination, which was always understood to mean and intended to mean at the time, the original meaning of it was discrimination against men or women because of their sex. But now they've taken that, they've twisted it, and they've seriously expanded it. Okay, now this can be done. Okay, if there's the political will for this, they should do this through Congress. But they shouldn't do it through a Supreme Court decision. But that's exactly what they did with Justice Gorsuch. You know, our hero, Justice Gorsuch, the guy who's supposed to save us, writing the opinion. And this was a 6-3 decision with both Justice Gorsuch and Chief Justice Roberts siding with the so-called liberal wing of the court. 6-3, expanding Title VII to include prohibition of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, i.e. transgenderism. So this is what's come out of the court now. They're legislating from the bench because they believe that these things are discriminatory and should be changed. And maybe you do too, and I think a lot of people believe this. Well, guess what? We have a process for that. That can go through Congress. That's how legislation is supposed to be done, not through the Supreme Court. We've got other big rulings coming down. There's going to be a ruling coming down on the abortion case out of Louisiana that required doctors to have admitting privileges at a local hospital to be able to perform an abortion, which prevents a lot of these doctors because they don't have admitting privileges because they just work at these abortion clinics like Planned Parenthood, and they don't admit patients to a hospital because they don't actually provide medical care for anybody. All they do is provide death for little babies in the womb and then vacuum them out. That's all they do. That's their job. That's considered medical care. What about do no harm? First, do no harm, right? The Hippocratic Oath. What about that? No, they're allowed to do that. And that all comes from a decision 50 years ago that basically said that an unborn baby wasn't a person. It was a fetus. Of course, back then, we didn't even know how developed these babies are in the womb, that at 18 days after, the beginning of the child, after conception, 18 days, the creature has a heartbeat. The baby has a heartbeat. It's not just a fetus. It's not a lump of cells. It's not a disembodied thing that we can just vacuum away. It's a person already, and it only gets more developed from there. So we expect the abortion ruling to come out. I'm not holding my breath that that's going to be positive for the conservative legal movement. We've also got Trump's tax returns ruling to come out. So I'm expecting even more disappointment from this group at the Supreme Court who has let us down so much. And what a disappointment, what a shame they are to say that they uphold conservative principles, to say that they follow textualism and originalism. And the truth is they don't. They decide how they want the outcome to happen, and they make the ruling up from there. Now, one other story that we have to cover with you, and we had a bunch more we didn't get to, but I got to hit this one, and we'll call this one our Out There. You probably didn't hear about it, but last week on Tuesday, there was a major clash between the Indian Army and the Chinese Army on one of their borders, right?
Oh, yes.
20 Indian Army troops are admitted to have been killed in this clash, and the reports are that there were 43 PLA, People's Liberation Army, remember the language of revolutionary struggle, which China is a part of. 43 Chinese troops were supposedly killed, although China won't admit to it. And this is an armed conflict in the Gowan Valley. So how far are we from actual war breaking out between India and China? This is a big deal, folks. These are all nuclear-armed powers. Pakistan's in the mix as well. India's ordering more warplanes on an emergency basis. Keep your eye on what's going on in the East because war's coming, it looks like. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.